So the older generation have ruined it for the younger generation. That's the message of some environmental campaigners. Shame on you, old people. You've messed it up. You weren't paying attention. You were greedy. You were lazy. You ruined it for all of us. Now, it's fun to be angry. It's quite a popular emotion at the moment. It's contagious. Social media is full of it, but it doesn't get you very far. And normally we don't need to be angry because God has everything under control. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in Joshua chapter 5, there is a clear difference in the generations. And it comes at an odd time because they've just passed over the Jordan into Canaan, and the ark went ahead of them. Remember, we saw that. They set up these memorial stones so that they wouldn't forget, so that they would remember. And now we're on the west bank. They're in the promised land, not far from Jericho. That attack is still to come. They could attack them at any minute. But what happens? What happens? Let's read. Get a Bible, get an actual Bible, and read Joshua chapter 5. We're going to start at verses 2 and 3. So Joshua chapter 5, verses 2 and 3 goes like this. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haraloth. So, what is circumcision? It's something you do to a boy's, never you mind. And if you do it when they're 8 days old, when they're a small baby, it doesn't hurt too much and it heals quite quickly. And it leaves a permanent mark. So it's something that Abraham was told to do to his son Isaac and to all of their future sons. Jesus was circumcised because he was a Jew. All of the disciples would have been, and the Apostle Paul. Jewish people continue to practice circumcision for boys to this day. Christians don't do it now because we have baptism, but that's a whole other thing that's too big even for the action replay at the end. Now, why is Joshua being told to do this? Why here? Why now? What's going on? If only there was some way of knowing. There is. It's in verses 4 to 7. So let's read those now. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. Though all the people who had come out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, until all the nation, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. The Lord swore to them that he would not let them see the land that the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. So the key there is in verse 6. All the men died in the desert because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. Now remember, Moses sent spies into the land when they got to the edge of Canaan, and they came back saying the Canaanites are too big and their cities are too well defended. And Caleb and Joshua said, "We can do this," but everyone else said, "No, we can't." And God said, verse 6, "I will not let you see the land that I, the Lord, swore to you." So that entire generation died in the desert, and he waits until they've all died. And God starts again with the next generation. He doesn't hold it against the next generation. He doesn't hold them accountable for what their fathers and forefathers did. He's delivering on his promises. He's determined to bless his people. And you see that throughout Genesis, actually. That happens a lot. The world is full of sin and wickedness, and God sends a flood. And he starts again with Noah. The people build a tower up to heaven at Babel to become like God. And God scatters them and confuses their speech. And God starts again with Abraham. Moses leads them out of Egypt, but the people don't believe the promise. So he kind of starts again with Joshua and this new generation here in chapter 5. And this is what we see happening here. God's hitting the reset button with this new generation. And so they need the mark of being one of God's covenant people, going back to that covenant to Abraham. which is circumcision. And they need to do the other thing that marks them out. And we're going to read about that in verses 10 to 12. But let's just read verse 10 and you get the idea. Verse 10. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. So it's the Passover. It's the special meal that God gave to his people to avoid the angel of death in Egypt on the last plague so that they could be released, so that they could be free. And that's what God's people do on the west bank of the Jordan. Celebrate the Passover using the land that they're now in. The land that's flowing with milk and honey. There's loads of food available for the first time. The manna stops. That's how God's been feeding his people for decades. It's been raining bread every night for the best part of 40 years. I know, kind of amazing, isn't it? So let's note the kindness of God. He's providing for his people all this time. He's led them out of slavery and into this land. He's led them there. They're there. And so he's right to be angry with the people who are ungrateful, who don't trust him, who don't believe his promises, who disobey him. But he doesn't hold it against the next generation. He limits his anger. He's way, way more kind and patient than we are. But here they are, militarily speaking, they are very vulnerable. They've just crossed the river. They've just landed on the other side. It's like the D-Day landings when suddenly everyone's arrived on the beach, and that's the point where they're most vulnerable when they're trying to get organised. But here's Joshua being told to circumcise all the males, which is going to hurt and put the fighting men out of action for quite a few days whilst it all heals up. And now they're having a Passover meal. See, now will be the time for the people of Jericho, for the Canaanites to attack and drive them back into the river. But again, God's kindness is evident here. And it's there in verse 1, which we've not read yet. So let's read that as we finish up. Joshua 5 verse 1 says this: As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord dried up the waters of Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. The Canaanite people are terrified because the people of Israel have a God who is incredibly powerful. He's done all these things. Now, he's not just their God, he's our God. He's your God, he's my God. This is our God. This is our God that our friends and neighbours need to make peace with. And they can. Rahab showed that. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what you've done, what kind of lifestyle you've lived. You can make peace with the God of the Bible, with the Lord. And so here's the thought for the day. We see here God protecting his people while they get their own house in order, while they obey him, while they are faithful to him. And that's why I've called this video, this chapter, Faithfulness Now. Faithfulness now. That's what God asks of us. Faithfulness now. It kind of doesn't matter what the last generation did. God's not going to hold that against us. He's been dealing with them. We may live with the legacy of what they're doing, but God can do anything. Now stop worrying, stop being angry, and be faithful now. And it kind of doesn't matter what you've done before. If you've committed sins that still bother you, if you've repented of them before God and you're still anxious, if you've asked for forgiveness, you're forgiven. It's gone. It's forgotten. Jesus paid for it on the cross. He died. He rose again. He ascended into heaven. He is seated in the heavenly realms. You can't change that. You're forgiven. So you can be faithful now, without guilt, without fear. We can serve him. We can pray to him. We can read his word. We can tell others about him without guilt or fear. We can be faithful now. So that's the thought for the day, something to pray. Let's fuel our prayers by fixing our eyes on Jesus Christ with these brilliant words from Hebrews 12, which really, really look forward in the light of all the stuff that's happened in Israel's past that is covered in Hebrews 1 to 11. Here's Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Why don't you turn those words into a prayer of your own? Amen. So, thought for the day, we've had something to pray, we've done something to say. When you're asked about this afterwards, you can say, God keeps starting again. God keeps starting again. Okay, that's it. There's an action replay to come, but I just wanted to flag up the fact that I've done 8 of these. They take ages. I have a day job and I also need a holiday. So next week there'll be a shorter video in which you're going to be doing the work, and you're going to be looking at the next chapter of Joshua, which is the Battle of Jericho, which is the one that you've been taught in Sunday school that you know all about. But actually, if you read the text, it might actually start to make a bit more sense, and you might start to spot things that you hadn't spotted before. So that's the idea. And then the week after that, I'm going to recommend that you watch the Bible Project video about Joshua, which will give you a big overview of the whole book, which I think will make a whole load of stuff start to slot into place. I don't quite know what happens after that. We'll make a decision then. Just for a bit of background, I've also got to write a book about John's Gospel, so I'm going to be doing a lot of reading around that, so maybe we'll start journeying with John rather than Joshua, but we'll keep you posted. Why don't you subscribe to this YouTube channel? That might help, and then you'll be kept bang up to date with developments. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Action replay to come, and it's a good one. So, action replay. I said earlier that Moses leads the people out of Egypt, but the people don't believe the promise, so God starts again with Joshua. I mean, that's sort of what's happening here in Joshua chapter 5. In fact, in Exodus 32 in the desert, there's an incident with a golden calf in which God's people make an idol out of gold. Aaron helps them in this, would you believe? And Moses is up the mountain talking to God. And Moses finds out what's happened, and God finds out, and he is really angry. And he says in Exodus 32, "Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you." So I'm going to start again with you, Moses, like you're going to be like Abraham, the father of a great nation, whereas Moses is just the prophet. But Moses intervenes and begs God to be merciful. And God does relent. But in a way, he's sort of proven right, because God's people do prove themselves to be distrustful of God, and that their hearts are far from him, and they don't believe his promises. And despite the plagues and the Passover in Egypt, despite the parting of the Red Sea helping them out, despite the bread that rains down on them and the quails as well that they get to eat, to be fed in the desert, they still don't believe that they can enter the land of Canaan, which is pretty sad, isn't it? And that makes God quite angry. But here's a side note. It's weird, isn't it? We think we're allowed to be angry. We applaud anger these days. Everyone's very angry. We join in. It's virtuous. I'm angry about this. You should be angry about this too. And if you're not angry, there's something wrong with you, or you're a terrible person. Anger is good. But what about with God? Apparently he's not allowed to get angry. How can you believe in an angry God? Ugh, I don't like anger. Anger's terrible. Such a negative emotion. Well, we should expect this kind of stuff in a very, very confused world. And actually, if we read the Bible, God shows us what true, righteous anger looks like. And he is way more merciful than we would dare to believe, even though his anger is really terrible and terrifying. And God shows his people, though, to a land flowing with milk and honey. We saw that phrase in Joshua 5 verse 6. I kind of passed over it, but it's quite a popular phrase that comes out of the Bible. A land flowing with milk and honey. And we last saw that in Exodus 13 at the first Passover. And here we are. This is actually the third Passover that the Bible mentions. They have another Passover when they cross the Red Sea. They have the Passover every year, but the Bible doesn't always report it. Actually, the Bible reports 6 Passovers in the Old Testament. This is a fun fact I wasn't even going to say. And then the seventh, 7, holy number, is in the Gospels. Jesus at the Passover. And what's he about to do? He's about to die on a cross. He's about to be the sacrificial lamb. It all ties up. It's kind of incredible, isn't it? It's almost as if God's given us his inspired and inerrant word, which makes complete sense, if only we'll read it. So read it. I hope you're getting a taste for that through these videos. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time when you're going to do most of the heavy lifting in the next chapter of Joshua.